Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string with a little bit of ice on it this time of year for some reason is our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you this chilly evening?
Oh, well, I walked through snow. That was hilarious. But otherwise, yeah, I'm all right.
Yeah, I happen to be living in a city where the flood watch is being temporarily postponed so we can have a blizzard. So it's life.
It brings back memories.
Oh God, yeah. Nothing like a mid to late April, or I suppose this is mid. Nothing like a mid-April blizzard to really bring back all those wonderful memories of having to evacuate and have no power for a couple of days. Yeah, just really
good stuff all around.
Fun stuff. Yeah. No, there are very few things more unnerving than driving over a bridge with water like that close to the bottom of it. It's just fun. I'm enjoying myself, and you should be too. Welcome to Norse Code. Hope you guys enjoyed our last episode, which was all about kickers. Yeah, let's go with that.
It was all about kickers.
It was all about kickers and ensuring the safety of your lemons and lemon trees. So go ahead and take a listen to that if you have not had a chance to do so. We have a couple of things we wanted to talk about, and we have a special guest. We are going to be talking about the departure of Marcus Sherrills, the influx of the AAF, also allowing Arif to grieve. He sat Shiva for, I believe, 48 hours, so I believe he's ready to handle all things AAF. And our guest is going to be Michael Kist from Bleeding Green Nation, who was an awesome guest before. So we will have some fun with there, and we'll definitely be talking about the mailbag as well. But before we start, just want to thank you guys for listening and appreciating all the support you guys have given us over the years. We do have a new donation from David Peterson over on Patreon. Again, thank you, David. Really do appreciate it. You do not need to give much. You can give as much as $1 if you'd like. $1 a month is more than enough to help us out, help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. You can also do something through paypal.me/NorseCode, and that's just a one-time donation to us. Patreon, obviously, being more of a subscription-based. If you hear value in the content that we provide over the off-season, during the regular season, occasional live shows, if you enjoy what we do, throw us a couple of bucks and help us keep the lights on, help us keep the costs down and all that. So, again, thank you, David. Really do appreciate it. And let's just jump right in with the big news of the past 3 weeks. And let's start with the AAF stuff first. The AAF has disbanded, but I don't even know if that's even the right term for it. The AAF is no longer in existence as a legal entity, but it can still be sued.
Well, no, it still actually exists because it's suspended operations and laid off most, but not all, of its employees. So it still technically exists as an entity to be sued, which I think is the reason it exists.
It exists on paper to be sued at this point.
Yeah, so that it could absorb all the liability so that, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure some lawyers listening to this being like, Arif, that's not how this works at all. And I'll be like, yeah, no, it exists so that, the company could absorb the liability and you can't sue the individuals. Like, Arif, that doesn't make any sense. Don't worry about it. But yeah, no, it's a mess. There have been a bunch of stories. We've got a couple of them are up at The Athletic, but you can find some of the stories about how crazy the league was over at Sports Business Journal, over at Yahoo, over at Deadspin. There's a ton of places. I'm sure you're all kind of basically, if you're interested, you're caught up now. But yeah, just one day, just folded, and all the players were like, "Oh, okay, I didn't expect this because I had no reasonable expectation of this at all, based off of the things that you were telling me."
Yeah, and then when restaurants are about to go under, one of the things a chef friend had said is that the way that you can tell a restaurant's about to go under is you can find out if their linen orders are still going in or not. Because if their linen orders are not going in, they're going to end up canceling. There's really no determining factor in the death of the AAF for a fledgling football league. This came just right out of nowhere.
Right. Yeah. And like, obviously, if you go back and look at kind of all the things that happened, you could say, oh, there's a red flag here. There's a red flag here. There's a red flag
Canaries
here.
in the coal mine and whatnot. Yeah.
Right. But it's always easy to go back and see the signs of a league that was going to fold versus if the league had kind of sustained itself, we would look at those signs as, oh, this is just kind of what a struggling, upstart league has to deal with. So it's very difficult to identify kind of at the time. I was talking to Rich Orenberger, who's a former center for the Patriots and the Chargers, and also was the color commentator or play-by-play commentator, broadcaster for the San Diego Fleet for the AAF. And I was talking to him about kind of how he got into it because he'd been retweeting a bunch of these player stories. He retweeted and shared a story about Gioni Paul, who has like a fractured arm. And so he goes into surgery on like Saturday for his fractured arm, wakes up on like Monday, and he has a bunch of texts saying like, you need to pack up your stuff and go. But yeah, I was talking to him and he was telling me that the AAF contacted him and set up, his kind of his broadcast system for him to broadcast games basically a couple of days before the first game that the San Diego Fleet were playing in, which is just like insane to me. And so like you could say that that's a sign, but at the time, it's very easy to kind of like, push these things aside, right? Like we take a look at the capital infusion they had in week 2 from Tom Dundon, and we can just say, hey, maybe that's just like maybe they're right. They don't need that money. They just happen to get it after week 1 proved that they were a viable product or something, right? Because that's what I think a lot of people were spinning it as, hey, there's at least one investor who wanted to see 1 week of games before investing, and that's all it was, right? And so you could say that after the fact. But really, they needed the money. It turns out later we found out that Reggie Fowler, who previously was planning on buying the Vikings, did not want his finances looked over by the NFL, so he couldn't be a majority owner of the Vikings. So he ends up joining an ownership group with Zicky Wolf as a minority owner, and then he ends up either selling his shares or pulling out of that. Reggie Fowler is one of the primary investors in this league, and it turns out he just like didn't have the liquid assets to keep the league afloat, which means, I guess the NFL was right to try and investigate whether or not he had money. But yeah, it's like that's like an issue. There's a payroll glitch between week 1 and week 2. And I remember at the time I was thinking, okay, I believe that they had enough money on hand to pay players week 2, and that the concerns about players not getting their payroll in week 2 were about switching to a new payroll system. If I believe all of that, fine. But why are you switching to a new payroll system in week 2? That's like bizarre and alarming. And so it's this league that's been run kind of this way this whole time. But, from the perspective of like a player, you're getting your paychecks every single week. You're being transported to and from games. You're staying at, apartments or hotels that the league is paying for. The hotel is not like contacted you and said, hey, no one's paid for this room. So that's all taken care of. You have meetings and meeting rooms. You're having those games. People are showing up to games. There's broadcast rights. People are tweeting about the league. It seems fine. There's athletic trainers that are working on the players that are injured. So from a player's perspective, it seems fine. And then one day you find out that the hotel has charged your room on the card that you use for incidentals. And like, oh, okay, great.
Yeah, it all kind of went to hell. And I think the thing that kind of surprised people was the fact that, we had gotten so deep into the season. And the fact that it ended up disbanding like that quickly. This wasn't something like if it would have disbanded after week 1, be like, okay, it was a complete bust. All the mistakes that could have possibly been made were made, and that was the end. But the league ended up surviving for a couple of weeks there, and it seemed, I don't know if you would say like traction would be the right word, but it seemed like it had a few things going for it, despite the fact that it was incredibly poorly run.
Yeah, and my guess for why it folded before the end of this, like right before essentially the end of the season, my guess would be something related to a vendor or a contract that executed in week 10 that was really expensive. And some of the most expensive, things that they have to pay for are not player salaries, but things like the equipment that you use to work out with, the weight room equipment and stuff like that. So if the vendor contract executed. Maybe you can return the equipment and not have to pay for it. Insurance for those players often costs more than their salaries if you have to pay out the insurance in week 10. But yeah, so like there's all sorts of things that it could be that maybe potentially execute week 10 that they felt that the league was going to fold anyway. And while it would have been nice to get to the championship game on April 27th, right before the draft, and during like Game of Thrones or something, like plan better next time, I guess. But, while it would have been nice to get to that championship game, you would have absorbed a ton more in terms of losses than if you just folded right away. I think maybe it helped motivate closing it down earlier rather than later. And then, of course, there's like this rumor about the technology that, potentially Tom Dundon, the majority stakeholder now in the stockholder in the AAF. The stakeholders are like fans and players, I guess. But like the majority like owner of the AAF at this point, the question is he going to try and steal the technology, or not even steal, but like, buy the technology? And then, I was speculating that maybe he was a patent troll that was trying to secure the rights to the intellectual property of the some of the ideas in the gambling app that they're developing. But it turns out MGM Casinos owns that technology, I guess. So that's probably not it. There's this conversation about, whether or not he was trying to negotiate with the NFLPA. The NFLPA wasn't budging, which like they represent NFL players. They don't represent AAF players. I have no idea why they thought they had leverage in a negotiation with the NFLPA.
Right.
Because, I mean, you get paid more on a practice squad and you're less likely to get injured. Why wouldn't the union want that arrangement to stay the way it is? But yeah, so I'm just like very like curious, and I don't know if we'll ever learn the full story. Like, hopefully there's going to be another, small potatoes 30 for 30 on this. But
just admit that you're crestfallen. That I think that's the best word to describe how your weekends are now being spent. Is you're crestfallen over the.
Everyone seems to think that I'm like way more hurt than I am. I'm like disappointed. It kind of sucks, but like I wasn't planning my weekends around the AAF.
I happen to believe you're a liar. I can judge this purely on the amount of AAF content that you were pumping out during what seemed like every other game. It was like the closest to an all 22 the AAF had.
I'm just saying, paychecks are paychecks.
It is a desert of an off season for sure. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about the AAF in just a moment, but we should talk about the departure of Marcus Sherrills, who is now going to be a New Orleans Saint, if I remember correctly. We described him once on the show, not last year, but the year before, as both the most overrated and underrated player on the team. As both a gunner and a returner. He was quite good and well established in his role, and will now be doing that in New Orleans. I guess the first question I have is this seemed to come, I say a bit out of nowhere, but there was always some sort of chatter about Marcus Sherrills leaving, like every year.
Yeah, well, there's chatter about him leaving every year, but that was mostly motivated by whether or not the Vikings would cut him, and it turns out they never got the opportunity to cut him. He was a step ahead because he signed with another team in free agency as opposed to, anything else. So, I mean, I was primarily concerned that the Vikings would not be able to re-sign him because Mike Prefers with the Browns. And maybe Sherrills has a strong relationship with Mike Prefer. I mean, that would make a ton of sense. And so I figured that there was nothing necessarily mooring Marcus Sherrills to the Minnesota Vikings, obviously, except for the fact that, he's from Minnesota. His brother, I think, is still at the University of Minnesota. And he's got family here. But, like, there's nothing in terms of the relationship with the Minnesota Vikings that may be mooring him here, or it's just kind of easier to let go now that Mike Prefer's not there. And I figured that might be a thing, but I was still surprised when it actually happened, that it actually played out that way. And so, that I think, obviously it quote unquote frees up a space in terms of cornerback depth, but you still have to figure out what you're going to do, a punt returner and kick returner. And, maybe Amir Abdullah is going to be the kick returner, but I think it will increase the Vikings' interest in players like Mecole Hardman, Georgia wide receiver, who led the NCAA in punt return average last year. And he's in the draft. He ran like a 4.32 or some crazy number like that. And he was an all right receiver. Maybe they'll just have, people like Chad Beebe, Brandon Zylstra, probably more Beebe, compete for the punt return job, and they won't look specifically for punt returners. Stanley Morgan Jr. from Nebraska did kickoff returns, a couple of punt returns, wasn't spectacular statistically at them, but has a skill set that should translate. And so, he might be a guy to look at. There's a couple of punt and kick returners in the draft. And the Vikings have looked at a couple of those guys every year anyway. So I'm kind of curious if it increases the importance of that. Obviously, I'm remembering when, Percy Harvin was traded to the Seahawks, the Vikings traded up to get Cordarrelle Patterson, not just because, Harvin was a starting receiver and that they needed, a receiver, but also because, Harvin at the time was the best kickoff returner in the NFL. And so they were looking for a way to kind of replace that. And it turns out, I think at the time they said, oh, you can't replace Harvin. You just try to make do. And then Patterson outperforms him and is the best kick returner in history. And, then you're in a spot where you're kind of molding your team around, the fact that your special teams are so good with Marcus Schultz at punt return and Cordarrelle Patterson at kick return. And now you don't have either of those things. You've got an open question at kick returner every year. And now you don't even have that punt returner who's still performing at a high level. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Obviously, Marcus Schultz is 30, and so the Vikings needed to think about kind of the long-term replacement there anyway, and it's not like you can just roster a backup punt returner. You don't have the space for that. Like you don't have the space for a backup long snapper. So, it's curious. It maybe opens up some questions about what they might do in the middle of the draft or how they might move players up or down their board based off of whether or not they have that return ability. But then also, it hurts you in terms of punt coverage on the other end, right? Because he's such a good gunner. So, I think it's really curious. I think increases the likelihood that Brandon Zylstra makes the roster because of his special teams ability, because he can do a lot of the stuff that Sherrills did that wasn't necessarily returns, and then maybe he can also do returns. It changes the dynamic and the nature of the conversation in a way that, we haven't had to worry about since like 2011.
Right. The other, I say departure, but it wasn't actually a departure. It was more of a discussion on possible trade. It came out today that there was an attempted trade of Everson Griffen to the Browns. So it was Kevin Zeitler, and he used to play for the Bengals, correct? And just recently, had signed with the Cleveland Browns. So Browns guard Kevin Zeitler, who was made redundant by the Browns draft picks, like Austin Corbett and so on. The Browns, and they already had Joel Bitonio. The Browns had like 4 guards and no tackles, and they end up having to play some of their guards at tackle. So it would have made sense from the Browns' perspective to complement Myles Garrett with Everson Griffen because they were going to get rid of Emmanuel Ogbah, which they ended up doing. And then also from the Vikings' perspective, obviously they need an offensive lineman, and it's one way to get out from under Everson Griffen's contract. Yeah, and this would have been right before the Vikings were re-signing him as well. So, and if I remember the article correctly, this ended up being nixed right around the time that the Browns somehow ended up with Odell Beckham. So.
Yeah, the Browns made the right choice.
Yeah. Let us be clear. This is not a criticism of the Browns at this point. Anytime that you're able to do that. By the way, we're just league is weird. The league is dumb. It's quite weird. When the Browns end up with like the 6th seed next year, and apparently the Browns are on their way up, and then don't make the playoffs again for 20 years, and be like, okay, we're back to the status quo. But the league is dumb. Let's. Yeah. Right. So anyway, Everson Griffen was it was discussed as a potential trade. Didn't end up happening, but it was worth mentioning because we did end up re-signing him and giving him a decent amount of money. So just worth discussing. But so,
I think the Vikings were right to explore it. I think that some package that involves a player swap will largely be good for the Vikings. Zeitler was like top 5 or 6 guard in the league last year. He was a top 10 or so guard in the league the year before. And obviously he's athletic enough to be kind of a system fit for whatever the Vikings do. So that would have been, a pretty good move for the Vikings. Obviously it would have been sad to see someone like Everson Griffin go, though.
Yeah, and for all those that have said the Vikings aren't doing enough to address the offensive line, they were literally willing to potentially get rid of Everson Griffin. Yeah, of a team captain in order to address the offensive line. It may have their attention this year. It's possible. But what also seems to have their attention is the AAF, because we now have 5 former players from the AAF that are currently signed to the Vikings, and I would imagine we'll be seeing maybe one of them make the practice squad, maybe one of them actually making the actual team itself. But let's go through the AAF arrivals here, starting with Greer Martini over at linebacker.
Is a Greer Martini linebacker for the Salt Lake Stallions, part of a linebacker core that was fairly up and down. Also includes Gianni Paul, who I just talked about, broke his arm. But they were a very up and down linebacker group. And so their ups were very high. I think both of them ended up with picks, and I think Greer Martini ended with a pick 6. And for the most part, really splashy plays, but then also ended up kind of out of position a lot in coverage and in the run game. So very up and down, pretty athletic. For the Packers in the preseason, Greer Martini had a really good preseason, and I think a lot of people who follow the Packers were surprised when he didn't make the team, especially certainly the Packers never have linebackers anyway. He's, I think, a valuable addition, and I think that he'll be competing with obviously people like Devontae Downs and Kentrell Brothers for that bottom of the linebacker spot. And I think he's kind of a legitimate competitor and not necessarily just a camp body, because he's got some pretty good upside to him.
All right, next up is Jordan Martin, safety.
Jordan Martin is a player I don't know anything about.
Sweet. Other than the fact that he was on the AAF. We'll go with Duke Thomas, cornerback.
Yeah, so Duke Thomas it's very similar to a lot of the cornerbacks the Vikings just tend to grab. Very physical, very penalty prone, both in terms of his grabbiness, he'll cause pass interference penalties, but also he'll just hit people during a play, and sometimes that's allowed and sometimes that's not, and he needs to know the difference. But he's kind of a fun guy to watch. I would say, and he wasn't really the best cornerback, or even I would say one of the top 8 cornerbacks in the AAF. I think PFF has him 9th. I don't know if I'd put him there. I'd put say Cameron Kelly and Devontae Bosby, who are ranked lower in PFF's ratings. I put them above Duke Thomas, and so I would say he's not even a top 10 corner in the AAF. But again, he's relatively young, and he plays kind of the style that they like to play. And he made a couple of splash plays. He was out of position a couple of times, but for the most part, he's a guy that can kind of find his way to fit in the hip pocket and man coverage. I think he's one of the leaders in stops among cornerbacks against the run, and does a fairly good job in zone coverage. Again, likes to play very, very physical in zone coverage. So that's the kind of player he is.
And Carter Schultz, defensive end.
Schultz is one of the 2 guys that I am super excited from the AAF that the Vikings ended up signing. The other one being, the next guy, Darren Smith. But Carter Schultz led the AAF in run stops and in pass pressures. So, he was the league leader in both. He was leading the league in sacks for most of the year until Jaron Elliott at the very end of the year ended up having a multi-sack game and surpassing him. But for the most part, he was a sack leader, pressure leader, QB hits leader, stops leader, etc. Really, I think, solid all-around player in that league. The biggest issue is kind of, how he translates, because he's an undersized defensive end that a lot of people think of him as a run-first stopping defensive end. The thing is, in college, for UNI, he left UNI as not just the career leader in tackles for loss in their history, but second in sacks. So it's not as if he didn't pressure the passer. That's just kind of the mold of player that you kind of expected from him. And it's to be honest, it's kind of what I would expect in the NFL now. But when you think of like an edge defender who's run first, you think of like a 280-pound guy. You don't think of someone like Carter Schultz, who's undersized, right? Who's 6'2", 200 out of college. He was 240 pounds. I think he added maybe 10 more pounds in the AAF. But, he doesn't necessarily show the kind of flexibility that you'd expect from an undersized pass rusher, the speed that you kind of expect. But, he consistently makes plays at every level that he's played at. He nearly made the Vikings 90-man roster a couple of years ago in 2017 as a tryout body. As a camp guy, he attended Vikings minicamp. He got called up to Spielman's office, and Spielman told him, hey, we're gonna, be by your phone. We're gonna see if, you'll be a fit on the roster. They ended up, kind of going in another direction, but he very nearly made it. And the Vikings always pick like one player essentially from their tryouts to add to the 90-man roster, and then they end up cutting an undrafted free agent for that. And he was nearly that guy. He was, I think, on the Browns preseason group. He was in Panthers minicamp. He was in the spring league for a second, and then he caught on the AAF, where he's one of the best players there. So I'm kind of curious because he doesn't fit kind of the mold of the prototype, but he's just been productive. So that is a guy I'll keep an eye on.
And finally, Darren Smith at safety.
Yeah, probably the best defensive player in the AAF, maybe the best player in the AAF. It's like between him and Casey Sales on defense, and just like generally speaking, just like a high level player. I can't think of a player who I would say was better than him. Maybe Charles Johnson. But yeah, just really extraordinary level play. 6th level draft pick by the Cincinnati Bengals. Unfortunately, a year after Zimmer left, so you can't say there's any crossover there. But he played both in the box and up high as a free safety very well in the AAF. Ended up, I think, with 3 interceptions. Should have had a couple more. There's a game where he had 2 interceptions taken away by penalties that he didn't commit. Actually, Duke Thomas committed one of them. But penalties he didn't commit. He ended up with a couple of picks. And I think there was like one more pick sometime during the season where that didn't end up happening. And then also in addition to that, 5 additional pass breakups. So he really knows how to get his hands on the ball. Pretty decent at stopping the run. Wasn't like a leader in that, but did a very good job playing force and preventing running backs from bouncing back to the outside. Stayed disciplined in his gaps. I would say in the NFL he's more of a free safety than the versatile guy he was in the AAF, because the size and the speed of those players made it easier to be kind of a two-way safety. But in the Vikings system, you have to do both. So I guess the Vikings kind of saw both there. And I know I was talking to a couple of guys that I think the Browns ended up with him at one point, but the Bengals definitely had him. And I know that Tampa Bay Trey, who covers the Buccaneers, wanted to sign him out of the offseason because he's a guy that he liked in the draft a lot, and then he's played well in the preseason and stuff like that. And he seems like a guy that might need a chance. And so I would say, given how much the Vikings don't invest at safety, so it's unlikely they'll bring in any more, given how many safeties they have on the roster now, which is like 4, I think, there's a very good chance that Darren Smith makes the roster, and not just makes the roster, but becomes kind of the primary backup as opposed to Jaron Kearse, the primary backup at safety. He's the guy I'm most excited about. And then I'd probably say Carter Schultz is next. So those are the 2 guys I'd pay the most attention to. But yeah, it's kind of cool that they grabbed all these guys.
And someone who was not associated with the AAF, but the Vikings ended up signing anyway, was Sean Mannion, and he is a quarterback. And it seemed a bit of an odd signing, considering how the Vikings seem to be very close to Slaughter. But Sean Mannion is now on the roster.
Yeah, so I think the thing with Mannion is that the Vikings just really wanted a guy that would help out in the quarterback room, would be really good on the whiteboard, and would be able to help Cousins out on the sideline when you're poring over, the pictures of the defense and breaking it down and stuff like that. They wanted an additional quarterback that had veteran experience. So I think it's less about Slaughter and more about not having a quarterback like Slaughter be the primary backup. And the Vikings were still in competition to sign John Wolford, who was the second best performer at quarterback in the AAF, the other one being Garrett Gilbert, who signed with the Browns. And then they were also potentially trying to sign Brandon Silvers, who was the third quarterback for the Memphis Express. But Silvers and he actually ended up playing surprisingly well. But Silvers signed with the Jets, and Wolford signed with the Rams. So couldn't get those guys, but it sounds like they're going to bring in competition for Sloter's spot. But that's all secondary to Sean Mannion, who was occupying a QB2 spot that they just wanted to have a veteran be in. And I think that there's like a couple of things. I think the first is that Mannion comes from the McVay offense, and so you could probably share some insights there about kind of how that offense is developed, maybe install some of it for Cousins, although, I mean, it's not like Cousins can't do that, a little bit of that himself. He's got some experience of his own with McVay. But then, they can kind of incorporate those concepts in, and then also might help Zimmer, defensively game plan and stuff like that. So that's like maybe one aspect of it. But another one is just he's actually very similar to Cousins in a lot of ways, but in ways, that I don't love. Like, there's like a lot of things that, I say are positives for Cousins, and you take the good with the bad with him. And I think there's fewer positives with Mannion. So where both Mannion and Cousins are quarterbacks that you feel like need to have a rhythm going. They're both streaky. They'll like string together a lot of completions at once, but they might string together a lot of incompletions at once too. They need to have that rhythm going. They need to have a good supporting cast to let them, kind of shine, which, I mean, that he's a backup quarterback. So like, that's going to happen a lot. But, Cousins also just has a lot of tools that he doesn't have. He's a more accurate quarterback. He's got a stronger arm. I would say that Cousins has improved in pocket presence. I would say the pressure is not an area where he distinguishes himself against other quarterbacks or anything like that. But I'd say Mannion is like a worse version of that, where I think he kind of struggles under pressure more often. He tries to make a lot of the same throws that Cousins makes, but the ball doesn't get there in time. He didn't, I think, throw any picks in his only start in the NFL, but I think in that game he should have, if I remember correctly, that there's one pass that should have been picked off. And just generally speaking, the way that he plays is very dangerous, but unlike Keenum, unlike Cousins, doesn't seem to have the tools to kind of just get away with it. And so he's a very in the structure quarterback that even within that structure doesn't always have the tools to kind of get things going. But, I guess if he's good on the whiteboard, he kind of serves his purpose.
So you're saying Sean Mannion is a work in progress?
He's a work in progress. I would even say that don't expect the completed work in progress to be a masterpiece. But yeah.
Well, we promised you a guest at the beginning of the episode, so let's get into that. And as promised, we have a special guest for the show today. We are going to be talking about the draft with someone you may remember from a previous episode. He is a Philadelphia Eagles blogger, podcaster, and Macho Man enthusiast. He is Michael Kist. You may remember him from Bleeding Green Radio, which is also posted on Bleeding Green Nation through SB Nation. Mr. Michael Kist, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I don't know how y'all wrote me into this. This was not planned. Y'all woke me up from a nap to do this. And then I find out that Arif Hassan is going to be on with us. And I'm upset that I'm missing hockey. So, I'm glad to be here. But, there's other things I would rather be doing. But I'm going to give my best. I'm going to give 110%.
No, I hate you too. Don't worry about it. But
mutual hatred is really what keeps this podcast going. Whether it's Arif and I, Dusty and Arif and Carson Wentz. The only other thing that keeps it together is Arif's love of Seattle. So there's there's a little bit of love, but a surprising amount of hate. So
I know he's an integrated part of Seahawks Twitter now. I know they're constantly trying to pull him in.
Released me. I'm no longer a part of Seahawks Twitter. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
It's a real will they won't they relationship that you have with them. You'll end up back with them. They always come back.
I don't think you're really released until the based god actually tweets out that you're released. If I know anything about sports Twitter, it's that apparently he is everyone's master. So let's just go with that.
All right. I'll send him a pic of my feet, and maybe then he'll release me from Seahawks Twitter.
You do that, maybe I'll send you my big board.
So, Arif, I'll hand this over to you then.
All right. What's great about this interview is that it was organized maybe about 10 minutes before we started recording. I have no idea how much Michael Kist has watched these players in the draft, but we're going to talk about it like he's watched these players in the draft.
That's what I do all draft season, baby.
All right, so we'll get some Eagles questions out of the way, but then we'll mostly talk about stuff that pertains to the Vikings. First, the Eagles question: which quarterback do they draft to replace Carson Wentz?
Oh, probably Brett Rippon in day 3. I mean, you
That's
can get
good.
anybody
like
to do what that guy does, right?
Yeah.
No, I mean,
I
like,
got
honestly,
the coaching connection, right? Am I wrong
Right.
about that? Yeah.
No, yeah. No, I'm sure 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, you can make it work. But yeah, I would go with. We actually talk about this on the QB Sco show a lot on BGN Radio with Mark Schofield, talking about day 3 replacements, because Nate Sudfeld is only a 2nd round tender, and then you can look for somebody. I know they just signed Luis Perez from the AAF.
Yeah, look at that. Real QB of the future stuff right there.
Exactly. So he's the future Wentz replacement if he can make the team. So that tells you where I am with Wentz. No, I love Wentz, but day 3 prospect. We've talked about Tyree Jackson from Buffalo before, but we think he might go as far as day 2. We have some concerns about him.
Rough. Okay.
Yeah, but
now.
Rippon is my guy. We've been on that hill for a while, even though the NFL weirdly doesn't value him and he wasn't invited to the Senior Bowl. It's just been a weird process for him. So
I feel like everybody I talk to that watches these quarterbacks, like Rippon's their guy, but he's not. I haven't seen him mocked in day 2 at all. It's all 4th, 5th, 6th.
Yeah, I'll say that Rippon is the one that I like for the value you can probably get him at. I think that's the appeal for me, because I feel like he's got the skill set to actually like stick in the league as a backup and be a spot starter. I'm not projecting him as like a full-time starter, but he has enough there right now and the football IQ to go with it. He's got the NFL bloodlines and all that to be able to like do what where you draft him. He's probably going to overplay that by a little bit, and I don't feel like that about any other quarterback in this class. So maybe that's the appeal for me.
That's fair. Yeah. Well, I mean, quarterbacks are historically overvalued. So
right
in the draft.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Well, so next question: the Eagles, quote unquote, need a running back, depending on how much you think running backs matter to the running game. How do they draft one?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because before Jordan Howard, people were begging for Josh Jacobs. There's a faction of fans that really want a running back.
1-to-1. Josh Jacobs, Jordan Howard, same guy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But no, I mean, right now we're probably looking for a compliment. And I think there was a faction. I think there is a discussion or was an ongoing discussion about the possibility of drafting Josh Jacobs in round 1. Now, there's the analytics crowd that isn't going to value running as much as maybe the personnel crowd, the film crowd.
Right.
Joe Douglas versus Alec Hallaby. Alec Hallaby would not be in on a guy like Josh Jacobs in round 1. I think Joe Douglas would be a guy that was in on Josh Jacobs in round 1. I think you're more looking at round 2 being the earliest, that picks at 53, 57. You're looking at Darrell Henderson from Memphis, who is one, and I wrote about this for bleedinggreennation.com. Loads of fun, but also a perfect complement to the holes in the game that Jordan Howard has. And then also, he's a good back outside of that once you move on from Jordan Howard if he doesn't live up to expectations or have a career renaissance next year. So he adds that pass catching element. He adds the elusiveness, the broken tackles. That most runs of over 40 yards in the FBS last year, where I believe it was 12. And I think the next person only had 8. So like the guy just is a home run hitter and adds a lot as a third down back that you can get out into space and can make people miss, which is where Jordan Howard's game is really lacking. Jordan Howard will make the right decisions every time and then maybe gets you a little bit extra. I think Darrell Henderson gives you the home run hitting ability. If not, I don't think they move back into the 3rd to get a running back. I think they can sit at 4 and then get a guy like maybe a Darwin Thompson from Utah State, a Divine Ezigbo from Nebraska, Bruce Anderson from North Dakota State, just some names there. But they're a running back by committee team, so them going 1st round now, especially after adding Howard, would really be shocking to me.
So what do they do in the 1st round? Is it a cornerback or what?
Cornerback keeps getting mocked in the 1st round. I don't understand how, we have all these developmental young corners that we spent, all this capital on. I don't know how that player would fit whatsoever, other than maybe like week 1 or week 2 if Ronald Darby isn't available right away because he tore his ACL late in the season, but he's on a prove-it deal too. So I just don't get the idea that the Eagles are going to.
As a Vikings fan, having cornerbacks clearly doesn't matter as to whether or not you draft cornerbacks. So
right.
Your discussion is confusing to me.
Well, some teams draft well and make the playoffs every year, and some teams so we got that going for us. I mean, it's a 2-year run; it's no big deal.
Fantastic dynasty.
There's a Super Bowl in there too, just in case you forgot. But
yeah, it left. I think it's in Jacksonville right now.
That's it. Yeah. So we'll stop with the homer talk for a second while we talk about these defensive backs. But I don't think there's a corner that's going to be available to them that they take in the first round. I mean, I've seen so many different corners in the first round that I'm just like, what's going on? Because I mean, Greedy Williams, yeah, I'm there with Greedy's in the first round, but he's going to go before that. I don't see David Long or Brock Yassin or any of those guys. Marnie Arouarie. I don't see any of those guys as a first round guy that the Eagles would like to fit their system. So I think they pass on that. They may go safety. They're bringing in a lot of safeties for
really. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised to hear about safeties. I mean, I feel like they've got two starting safeties already, Malcolm Jenkins, Avonte Maddox, but then they brought in another starting quality safety in Andrew Zendaya. So I'm kind of surprised to hear that they would draft even another safety in round one.
Yeah, it's interesting you say Maddox and not McLeod when both of them can do it. But I think they moved Maddox around, and I don't think they necessarily might see him as like a full-time safety. They drafted him play nickel corner and kind of developed, but then he just kind of like wore this.
That's like four safeties.
Yeah, there's a ton of safeties, but I don't really classify him as a safety. Now, the thing is, okay, so Sendejo was brought in on like this cheap kind of deal, and I like Sendejo, and I think he gives you more than Corey Graham ever gave you from that Corey Graham role, which is just being a bad football player. But if you look ahead to the future, Rodney McLeod, banged up knee, and they restructured his contract. I wouldn't be surprised if this was last year in Philadelphia. You wonder how he recovers from that. And then you have Malcolm Jenkins, who is getting long in the tooth. And then after that, you have Andrew Sendejo, and we don't know exactly how they feel about Avonte Maddox. Now, what we do know is the fact that they're bringing in all of these top tier type safeties. They brought in Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. They brought in Juan Thornhill. They brought in Darnell Savage from Miami. So Darnell Savage from Maryland, excuse me. So they're bringing in all of these different top tier safeties. Now, ultimately, I do think that they go interior defensive line or something to that effect, maybe trade up for Cody Ford from Oklahoma if he starts to slip. But, Christian Wilkins, Jerry Tillery, someone like that. And then they go safety in the second round because at 53, 57, there are 8 guys that I have on my board that I would feel comfortable taking there. It's a total of 8 guys from day 1 to day 2 that they could take at safety, either at 25 or 53, 57. I think a good amount of them will be there in the second round. I think they know that. I think they attack the trenches first and then go safety in the second round. But I do think they are really going to heavily look at those guys and have been and consider that not only in the first round, but in the second round as well.
I'm done talking about the Eagles. Let's talk about players that are not on teams yet. Let's talk a little bit about, so the Vikings, a lot of Vikings fans have talked about, offensive linemen. A lot of people have become fairly familiar with offensive linemen in the first round, and I've said it might actually be a better proposition just in terms of the way the talent drops off at each position to get, say, a defensive lineman in the first round and an offensive lineman in the second, third, or fourth round, just because, or ideally 2 offensive linemen, 1 in the second, 1 in the third or fourth, just because the talent drop off, I feel like, unless you're talking about a Jonah Williams or maybe an Andre Dillard, depending on how you feel about him, that the drop off between round 1 and round 2 is a lot smaller, and versus like, say, Jerry Tillery or, by some miracle Ed Oliver falls or something like that, versus kind of what kind of 3 techniques we get in round 2 or 3. But we haven't actually, I think, as the Vikings community hasn't talked a ton outside of Dalton Reisner about, these day 2 guys, maybe even potentially day 3 guys. I don't know how much you've been watching these offensive linemen, but like, are you very familiar with people like Elton Jenkins and Eric McCoy and some of those interior offensive linemen you might find kind of in the middle rounds? Who do you like among them?
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I was looking at my day 2 guys. I actually have Elton Jenkins highlighted right here on my spreadsheet, so I'm glad you brought him up, the center from Mississippi State. I think he could play some guard as well. He's the 28th overall player on my board. Like, he's an exact candidate of what you're looking for in the second round that you mentioned, because in the first round, obviously, Andre Dillard is going to go high. Jonah Williams is probably going to go before 18. If he slips there, then you're fine at 18, but 18 is a bit of a risk. Jawan Taylor, Cody Ford probably going to go before that as well. So those are your main guys that you're looking for. Now, I'm a big Chris Lindstrom fan from Boston College. I don't know how high the league is on him, but he's another guy that you might see slip into that second round. So in the second round, you're looking at guys like Chris Lindstrom. You're looking at Dalton Reisner. You're looking at who else? Elton Jenkins, who you mentioned, who I really like. He's a top 40 player for me. And then you're also looking at guys like Drew Samia, the guard out of Oklahoma, who I think is awesome. And I would love for the Eagles to pick at 53 or 57 because they have some issues at guard, but it would make sense for the Vikings as well. So I agree. I think the drop-off, if all those top tackles are taken before 18, don't reach on a tackle. Don't take Yodny Kajust in the first round because you can probably get Yodny Kajust in the second round.
Yeah, plus he's soft, right?
Jeez, I saw that on Twitter. I argued with it. The guy was called soft for getting into a bit of a boxing match and then pulling up when he knew he was going to get penalized. So it's so weird because he was dominating that guy all that whole game and just frustrating him physically and after the whistle. So I don't get that whole he's soft thing. I'm not with it. But that guy's also a Greg Little fan, so I don't know what he's talking about. I don't trust his evaluations. But so. I mean, Greg Little is another guy you can probably get in the second round as well, unless the league likes him more than we think they do. So, yeah, I would agree. Second round is like your sweet spot for a lot of different offensive linemen, both interior and at tackle as well. If you're willing to wait around, which I'm sure that night, if the Vikings don't take an offensive lineman, the fan base will not be happy with that. But I agree. There's a ton of value in the second round, both interior and offensive tackle.
So where do you see kind of where the talent drop-offs are at some of these, important positions? Like, for example, I think the Vikings are going to, whether or not they trade Trey Waynes, I think they're going to invest in a cornerback probably day 2, if not then in day 3. But that I think is an interesting question because you've got these super athletes distributed throughout the draft at corner. People like Kendarius Webster, I see go like in the 7th round. I see, Jamel Dean and Isaiah Johnson. Isaiah Johnson might be a day 2 guy. I love him. Sean Bunting, Trayvon Mullen, like a bunch of really, highly tested athletes. And then obviously, you got Byron Murphy, who, ran a 4.5, whatever, DeAndre Baker, and Greedy Williams kind of at the top. Where do you see the talent drop off at, say, cornerback, at wide receiver, who the Vikings kind of might want to be interested in? I think at tight end, the talent drop off is like, at first, it's fairly immediate. But
then steady throughout.
Yeah. But like, what do you see kind of what the inflection points for a lot of these positions will be?
Yeah, I mean, for cornerback, I really like Greedy Williams, but I don't like him all that much because that whole competitive toughness question with him is concerning for me. I still have a top 30 grade on him. So I don't think the talent there is very immediate. And then you've got, Justin Lane from Michigan State is a guy that I really like. And I would not be shocked if he were to sneak into the first round, but I think I'm higher on him than most people. He's a wide receiver convert that has tremendous ball skills, can press you, but is a scheme-specific type of guy. After that, I mean, Byron Murphy is another one of those guys, but really it's kind of a pick your flavor type after that. You got the smallish DeAndre Baker, who's like a physical type dude, which is weird. David Long could go anywhere in the draft. So you said there's a lot of different places. So I don't know if there's a drop-off, but there's a lot of different unique skill sets that you have to kind of project there. Because if you're looking at a Joejuan Williams from Vanderbilt, well, I know I have to kind of press him, but his press technique is raw and he's a bit of a project. If I'm looking at Isaiah Johnson, who, by the way, I've heard that Chris Richard from the Dallas Cowboys has like googly eyes for Isaiah Johnson.
It's got to be, one of the Seahawks cover 3 alums that ends up.
And, he's an official visit for the Eagles as well. So he's another guy that I could see going day 2. If they did go corner, it would be a guy like Isaiah Johnson, who's got a fantastic athletic profile that you can project into a bigger role down the line. But I don't know if there's necessarily a drop off because I don't believe the top tier talent is all that top tier to me. But like you said, like it's littered throughout. Sean Bunting, like you said, Central Michigan is a guy who I love, and I think is going to sneak into day 2. So I think there's talent throughout. I just don't think the talent at the top is that high. So I would wait for corner and then pick the flavor that I like in day 2. That's how I am at the quarterback position. At the wide receiver position, I mean, is there anybody for me that's a first round worthy pick other than like DK Metcalf? I don't think so. There is a lot of tall tree guys I don't necessarily believe in. And after taking a risk on DK Metcalf, which it still is a gamble because you're projecting him out to a fuller route tree. And, everybody knows about the 3 cone. I think that's a bit overblown because you've got this tall freak that just can absolutely burn. But after that, I'm probably betting on the more polished guys like a Deebo Samuel from South Carolina or Kelvin Harmon from NC State before I go with guys like N'Keal Harry and Hakeem Butler. So, yeah, there's a drop off there for me. After DK Metcalf goes in the top 15, I'd be fine with not seeing another wide receiver taken until about pick 50, to be honest with you. Even though they're a little higher on my board, they're just not, athletically dynamic. It's a bit of a crapshoot. It's another pick your flavor type. There aren't many complete players at both of those positions that we're talking about. Same with running back, too. I mean, there's a significant drop off between Josh Jacobs, and I love Darrell Henderson, but he's not the complete type of back that a guy like Josh Jacobs is. So there's a lot of positions where you've got like one or two guys that you really like, and then there's like a whole mismatch, a goulash of different skill sets that you kind of have to fit into a system.
I'm a guy that like has just started to really like AJ Brown a lot. What keeps him out of the first round, do you think?
I think it's the polish on the outside, because he got pressed to outside action when DK Metcalf went down, and we saw, despite the fact that he's big, he's 226. We saw the fact that he had serious work to do against press coverage. Now, do I think he'll eventually get it? Yes, I do. But at the same time, this is a guy that's been living in the slot and working with free releases and everything like that. And now you're going to have to project him outside when you also have a draft class with a bunch of other guys with his same physical profile. Why not just take those guys that have operated on the outside and show them they can beat and press and whatnot, even though some of them haven't shown that. So I still do think that he's a projection. If you want to take him first round, you're betting on the fact that he can beat press on the outside without much evidence.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Who do you think? So, I mean, the Vikings always kind of invest in edge rushers in the middle of the draft, sometimes late in the draft, usually super athletes. And so we've got a bumper crop of those littered throughout the draft as well. Maybe I don't think the edge talent kind of in the upper middle, like after you get past your Josh Allen's, your Brian Burns, is amazing. But once you start to get into the 4th, 5th, 6th round, there seems to be a lot of guys, a lot of athletes. People like, it depends kind of if you see Zach Allen as an inside or outside guy, whether or not you see John Kaminsky as an inside-outside guy, Max Crosby, Ben Benogu. Who are the guys that you see as kind of potentially standout prospects that could be developed by, say, a good defensive line coach like the Vikings have from like a mid-round guy to be a potential starter?
I think on top of the guys that you mentioned, I do believe that's one of the positions where there's a serious drop-off in talent. You get to the second round and like your Chase Winovich from Michigan and your Christian Miller from Alabama. When those guys go, I think there's a serious dearth unless you're like a DeAndre Walker truther from Georgia or something like that. But if you're looking at day 3 guys, which you're going to have to wait a little bit before the talent starts to be worth the value again, Wyatt Ray from Boston College is a guy that I think you can develop for that role. Malik Reed is a guy who was a combine snub. He's from Nevada. Notice just a crazy worker, awesome work ethic, crazy football IQ, tested really well. He played some off-ball linebacker for Nevada, which was weird. He looked weird doing it, but he can do it, but also has some fantastic physical tools. He can bend the corner. That's a guy that I'm kind of looking at developing, a real under-the-radar guy. So you can get him day 3. Maybe you can get him as a UDFA, but you're talking about a guy who's got the traits that you want when it comes to the first step, get off, and the bend, has no clue what he's doing with his hands or anything else, but you have the mold of clay there, but then you also have the work ethic to go along with it. So you're more encouraged that he's going to be accepting and willing to take coaching to be able to take his game to the next level. It may take him 2 or 3 years, but again, that mold of clay is very attractive to me. So Wyatt Ray from Boston College, Malik Reed from Nevada are 2 guys that I'm eyeing. I'm not really sure after that, man. We haven't talked about Anthony Nelson from Iowa, who tested, I think, pretty crazy for what we were
great test,
expecting.
And also his line mate Parker Hesse or something like that tested really well too. Not as well as Anthony Nelson did for his weight, but crazy good testing.
Yeah, I was surprised by it. I don't know if it's like a Jordan Willis situation, but it got me intrigued. So that's somebody that I have to go back to the tape on still and take a look at, because he fits like something that like the Eagles might like. So forget the Vikings. I'm looking for the Eagles guys, but right. Those are some guys that I like. Wyatt Ray from Boston College, Malik Reed from Nevada, who I think is a super sleeper.
And then, kind of regardless of position, if you were to pick some a couple of, well, actually, no, let's talk about edge for a second. Mm-hmm. I saw a Twitter highlight of a guy from Canada named Matthew Betts, who obviously his last name is great.
Yeah.
From Laval, he ran a 6.773 cone. Do you know about this guy? What's the deal?
I saw him at the Shrine Week practices.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. You did. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was down there with the Draft Network guys, and we're watching this kid from Canada just like beat up on these offensive linemen. It doesn't make any sense when you look at him. Like, he looks like a high school student. He just looks like a regular dude that you would see at your local neighborhood Blockbuster Video, renting like WWE pay-per-views. It didn't make any sense. Like, I don't get how this guy was so good at what he was doing when he looked like that. It made me think that I could get into the gym and like be at the Shrine game in a week. But look, Matthew Betts is super interesting. Good luck trying to find. What is he from? Laval in Canada, I think. Yeah. I have no idea how to get that tape. I don't know if that tape is on YouTube, if it's handheld or whatever the tape is. But he was super intriguing. But you just look at him and go, there's no chance. There's like this just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, if he makes it, that would be amazing. I mean, I didn't see him like weigh in or anything like that, but I'm sure in shorts he just looks like a sloppy dude. Maybe he's put together. I don't know. Body types are deceiving.
His beard is not put together. I'll say I just Googled him. That is. You need some help, bud.
His pads felt like his pads didn't fit. It looked like he was at the first day of high school practice and his shoulder pads were too big. Like it didn't make any sense. So he was like one of the super weird guys who was like, this guy's balling, but like I still don't believe it. So what were we looking for? Sleeper guys? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah. So the next thing is a sleeper, any position.
I can't with Matthew Betts, man. He's too much. I'm rooting for him.
He's weighed in at 110 kilograms.
What does that mean? What does that
250 pounds. That's not bad. 250 pounds.
250 pounds? Is that the same in Canadian weight?
A little short. He's 6'3", a little short. But yeah, ran the 6.773 cone at 250 pounds. That's better than Sutton Smith, right? You can do something with that.
Oh, man, Sutton Smith, super undersized. Yeah, but no, if Matthew Betts is 250, then I'm 10 inches. I don't believe that, man. That was Canadian weight. Getting out the rails, baby.
All right. Let's talk about sleepers, any position. Who do you love day 3?
A guy that I really have my eye on day 3 is probably Bruce Anderson, the running back from North Dakota State.
Gross. Disgusting. Talk about someone else.
I knew you would like that. But me and Matt Waldman did a film room on him, which was, number one, an amazing experience already. Matt Waldman is amazing, and getting to sit down and like process film with him was such a cool experience. But we both love his game, and he's someone that we were in Mobile, and I remember he tweeted this out. He said, "There's a back out there that reminds me of Thurman Thomas. Who is it?" So when we got to Mobile,
that's such a Matt Waldman thing to do and
isn't
say.
It? Yeah, exactly. That's the classic Matt. So we're in Mobile, and I see Matt, and apparently he had like a pants malfunction to where he was wearing like these leggings with boots. It was a really weird combination, but it was hilarious, the story that he had about it. But I brought up the tweet, and I said, "Is it Bruce Anderson?" And he goes, "That's exactly who it is." And I said, "We should do a film room on him." And he's like, "Yeah, let's do it." And we did it, and it was dope.
That's disgusting.
So we do Bruce Anderson, who I feel like was underutilized in the passing game and was sharing, backfield time with all the different backs they bring in North Dakota State, because I don't know if you've heard, they're a bit of a powerhouse. So as a guy that's true. Who I have. He's my running back 5. Like, he's really high in my rankings. Like, if I were a scout, I'm pounding the table for him as soon as the 4th round starts, because I have a 3rd round value on him. And I think he's a guy that can be a immediate contributor as a 1A or as a 1B. So Bruce Anderson, who tested under 4.6, he was at 4.58 at the pro day, jumped well, has all the physical tools that you want. He's a former track guy. He's a former returner, played with Carson Wentz, so led a comeback against Northern Iowa, if I'm not mistaken, after halftime, returned a touchdown for 101 yards or something. But yeah, Bruce Anderson is a guy. The other one that I like is Darwin Thompson from Utah State. He's a JUCO transfer.
I feel like he just like appeared out of the ether like 4 days ago, and like people are talking about him a ton now.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was watching Utah State film, and I was watching Dax Raymond, the tight end from Utah State, who was another really good one, a great blocker, got a good athletic profile. Like, he's a guy that I really like at tight end, especially in day 3. If he goes that far, he's like one of those steady Eddie tight ends when you're talking about that next group down. But I noticed this small dude is taking on contact really well and shedding tackles and is good in the screen game in the open field and making safeties miss when they're trying to fill the alley. And I'm like, who is this kid? And I find out within 30 minutes, I'm like, yo, I found this dude. And then Dane Bergler, I don't know, like 15 minutes before that had said, hey, this dude is a combine snub. And I was like, oh, wow, that was a real roller coaster. So turns out, he balls at his pro day. He has fantastic explosion numbers. Like, this is a guy who's like 5'8", but he's 5'8", like 198, something like that. Like, he's rocked up and apparently like a big time gym rat and can lift heavy weight. So the way he was able to deal with contact at 198 is really impressive, but he's super strong throughout his entire body. So he's a guy that I think, he only has 1 year of production at Utah State. So that's like the scary part. That's why he's unknown. That's why he's a combine snub. But when you look at like what he could be, I think he's a really super interesting guy that could come out of nowhere. Because, I mean, he had Philip Lindsay come out of nowhere last year, and he played at a bigger college than this guy did. So Thompson is a guy I think you get in day 3, and ultimately you probably could get a decent amount of production out of immediately.
All right. Well, are there any original takes? I mean, because you just stole this one from Dane. Are there any original sleepers you like?
Look, Dane also said Khalil Hodge from Buffalo, the linebacker, was a combine snub, and the dude can't run. That's why he didn't go to the combine. So I don't want to hear it, Arif. I don't want to hear it. These are all original takes. That was a discovery by me. No one would know about Darwin Thompson if I did not put his clips on the timeline. That is a fact. I was first, and that's what matters. Not about being right. It's about being first.
It's about being first. All right, before I let you go, I got to do some lightning round stuff. I've just decided it's not like a thing that we do. I've just decided to do it now.
Well, this should go well.
I just want I've got this list of players who meet the Vikings athletic thresholds. I don't need your takes on Garrett Bradbury, Chris Lindstrom. I mean, I love Chris Lindstrom. It doesn't count. So I just want, one sentence or shorter takes on these guys that all happen to meet kind of interior offensive line thresholds for what the Vikings have traditionally done at the position. Although, who knows? That could change. They got a bunch of new coaches. All right, tell me, Phil Haynes.
What was that?
I need a sentence or shorter take on Phil Haynes, guard from Wake Forest.
Guard from Wake Forest. I have no idea. That's my take. I have no idea about Phil Haynes from Wake Forest. Is he an actual person?
Yeah. 33.5-inch arms, 322 pounds, ran a 1.78-10 split. That's actually not very fast.
Boy, you Vikings are desperate for an offensive lineman. You're spitting out.
But a 4.57 short shuttle, that's pretty good.
Wait, the real test if he's a human being, does he have a Wikipedia page? Like, that's how you know he's actually a prospect.
Probably not.
Okay, well, then he doesn't exist.
All right. Michael Jordan, guard, not that guard, the one from Ohio State who played center last year.
Yeah, he's aight.
Aight, okay.
I mean, day 3 guy. I'm fine with him.
Lamont Gaillard? Gaillard? Okay, so the first one. Okay, yeah.
Really good offhand usage. I like him. Was there a specific theme that I'm supposed to be hitting with these answers?
No. I just want to take.
Oh, yeah. No, I think he is actually pretty good. I think he's kind of underrated. I think he's a shrine game guy. I think you get him in day 3, and I think you could get a potential at least replacement level starter from him. I think he was solid at Georgia.
All right. Well, Vikings rumored to be interested in him, so that works out. Hjalte Froholt.
Hjalte.
Arkansas. Yeah.
Hjalte. I think you pronounced that correctly, too. Well done.
In Minnesota. Come on.
That makes sense. But no, I think it was Daniel Jeremiah called him like the ultimate, like if you want to develop a guy, then like he's your guy. He's an Eagles official visit too. I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings are interested in him. Like he's not a guy that he hits maybe 3 years, 4 years down the line, but like the to go back to the mold of clay thing, like that's the kind of athletic profile and apparently the work ethic and type of guy that you want to work with.
I was talking to a guy named Thor. How appropriate. I was talking to Thor Nystrom about him the other day, and he was like, yeah, he signed up because Brett Bielema does a very good job of developing NFL quality offensive linemen, and then Bielema left. So that's who you have.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. It's like this guy comes from Denmark to IMG Academy and carefully selects a school to try and maximize his possibility of NFL success, and then Bielema's.
So you're waiting to Bielema,
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's going to take 3 years.
Yeah, there you go. Ross Pierschbacher.
Pierschbacher, was he the one getting canned a bunch? Oh no, he's the center from Alabama, right?
Yeah, but I mean, he was getting canned, but like he wasn't the center for the national championship game.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, he's a 4-year starter, if I'm not mistaken. Like, the guy's got some experience playing some good competition. But, like, you saw, like, guys like Daylon Mack, the interior defensive lineman from Texas A&M, who's, like, got that low pad level.
Yeah, he's like 6 foot 320.
Yeah, exactly. And just, like, step him back, like, 3-4 times, and you expected it every time. So, like, he's another one that's like kind of but not as as Michael Jordan, I guess. I don't trust him as much. Like, smart player, but I don't know if like physically he's there for me.
Swing back up. All right, Ryan Bates.
Ryan Bates, I have not watched. What is he? The Penn State guy? No, it's McGovern. Oh, McGovern and Bates are both in the draft.
Yeah, they're both Penn State. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't seen much of Bates. I've been studying McGovern a little bit and catching glimpses of him.
Like 2 weeks, dude. What are you doing?
Man, I cover the Eagles. Like, all this stuff trying to wrap me in with draft Twitter, you're not going to get me, Arif.
You went to the scouting academy, man. Pay your dues. All right.
No, scouting academy, you evaluate pros at the scouting academy.
All right. Yeah, that's not translatable. Good point. Shaq/Dion Calhoun. I don't know what to call him.
Yeah. Shaq Calhoun. Have I seen it?
Same guy.
I'm getting him confused with someone else from 2 years ago, and I can't now think of that player, and my brain is frozen. So that's my take on it. My brain is frozen on that player.
Sucks, man.
I haven't seen him in depth, so I can't really speak on that. I've watched like about 120 guys, and you're hitting on some good ones here that I have not seen, making me look like a real jerk, Arif.
Good. You are a jerk.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I deserve every moment of it.
All right, here's a good one. I don't think he's going to get drafted, but the name stuck out to me. Yeah, you probably don't have a chance. Chandler Miller from Tulsa.
Who? What? Chandler Miller?
Yeah, but not the one in draft Twitter.
Is he going to be soliciting me for life insurance soon?
The Tulsa Center? Probably. He ran a 4.94 short shuttle.
Well, tell him that I have some issues with my liver enzymes, so if he can get me in at something more than 75,000, I am listening.
Thor told me to watch out for this guy, Youngstown State Center. Do you know who I'm talking about? Because I don't want to pronounce his name.
Youngstown State Center. I haven't watched a Youngstown State guy since, what was it, Derek Rivers? No.
Probably Derek Rivers, yeah. Vitas Hrunkiewicz. That's probably pretty good. I probably did a good job.
You probably nailed it. I'll have to see a production guide to that, but off the top, I don't have the science to disprove that. You can nail that.
If in case you were curious, Arif stretched before the show so he wouldn't pull something when he was patting himself on the back there.
Yeah. I mean, you should be at least standing up before you pull a name like that out of your ass.
Exactly. Arif, do we have one more?
Yeah, actually, let's talk about a Minnesota guy, Trey Pipkins, not a guard, tackle. Sioux Falls at the Shrine game, so you probably have a take.
Yeah, I mean, not good.
You don't.
Keep it moving. No, I saw him at the Shrine game. I was not compelled to go to the tape.
Oh, okay. Calvin Anderson, Texas.
No idea.
All right. Well, I need your Greg Little take then.
Oh, Greg Little? Yeah, I mean, he's just not very good yet. Like, he's a second round guy for me. But I feel like there's a drop-off between his pass pro and his run blocking. I didn't like his run blocking at all. And I think you kind of have to rebuild his pass set a little bit. Maybe I'm wrong with that, and I'm probably going to tick off like a weird sect of online Twitter, which you never want to hit that hornet's nest. But I don't know, man. I'm just not a big fan when you put him up against guys like Cody Ford and Andre Dillard and those guys in the second round. If I'm looking for a guy, I'll take Yannick Juiced, injuries and all, over Little. I think Little's the one who's soft. So at me about that.
There's the podcast title. Episode whatever. Michael Kist thinks Greg Little is soft. AWFT.
Yeah, exactly. And bring all the Twitter fights to you, because apparently you're repping the Mongolians this year.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my mentions are full of people trying to talk themselves into a Carthaginian Hannibal army.
Come on, man.
Carthaginian army taking on the Mongols, which is like such a technological. I can't with these people. It's insane.
It's unreasonable.
What are they doing? Like even Alexander wouldn't stand a chance against the Mongols. They beat Russia in winter. Like how would not be people underrate the Mongols so much? That's a whole other tirade I could go on though.
Yeah, it is tragic what the off season does to NFL sports writers and podcasters. It's just an absolute shame, especially with the AAF going under. It's not like you can just go out and punch horses every day. That would make it not special.
It's a special occasion, yeah.
Exactly. If you'd like to plug your show, go ahead.
Yeah, at BGN_radio on Twitter, and put in Bleeding Green Nation into any podcast app, and we will come up. Right now, I think our 5-star ratings are just dwarfing everything else. All the haters listen, subscribe, and give it 5 stars. So you should too. And we're covering a lot of the draft stuff too. I mean, obviously there's an Eagles focus, as you often see me revert back to on this show, but we're covering it league wide as well. So a ton of draft focus. I have great conversations on that too, and fireside chats. Guys like Dan Hatman, guys like the football director of Sports Info Solutions, Matt Manicherian. So tons of different content out there. Even if you're not an Eagles fan, you just have to stomach some of it for a little bit. I mean, Arif has done it. Me and him are still friends. So if he can make it happen, and we literally hate each other. We get face to face and we just start going at it. We got to be
fighting.
Yeah, exactly. If he can handle it, then I think you can as well. So subscribe to Bleeding Green Nation and drop a 5-star review. Even if you don't listen, just do it anyway because you like this podcast.
Strong.
Say you're following instructions. I don't care.
There you go. It's all the same to him. It's just more meat for his army. It's fine.
Yeah, click is a click, man. I won't clickbait you, but I will invite clicks.
Yeah, Michael Kist as the Night King. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. Thanks for talking about the draft and putting Arif in his place occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, he deserves it, and will continue to do so. So I'm going to scour his timeline and find some bad takes. I'm sure it won't take long. I appreciate you guys, though. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, man. Well, let's go to the mailbag, and let's start off with Raul, who asks, are there players in this draft known for their special teams ability that could help fill all of the roles Cheryl's played for us?
Not all of them, I would think. But like Morgan can probably fill most of them. Again, he didn't return a bunch of punts. I already talked about Mecole Hardman. I haven't dug through all of the draftees that have like returned punts or anything like that. But I would say that it's highly likely that the Vikings value Mecole Hardman a lot.
And the next question is also from Raul, who asks, Jonah Williams versus Garrett Bradbury. I get the sense Bradbury would be the better zone blocking guard. Would you still, however, prefer Jonah for his offensive tackle potential?
Yeah, so actually, I just wrote a mock over at The Athletic where I have to make this very decision. It's a companion mock. So Dane Brugler wrote an exhaustive 254 pick, 7-round mock draft, and I remocked it for the Vikings. And at pick 18, Jonah Williams goes to the Vikings in Dane's mock draft, and I have to make this decision between Jonah Williams and maybe Garrett Bradbury. And the way I characterize it is that I think it's a question about whether or not you want a great player who's a good fit, and that's Jonah Williams, or a good player who's a great fit, and I think that's Garrett Bradbury. You've got like strength concerns with Bradbury. You've got concerns about whether or not he can play anything other than center. You've got concerns about, whether or not, he has the ability to block nose tackles one-on-one and pass protection and stuff like that. Whether or not, he can deal with one-on-one pass block sets versus just play action stuff. They did that a lot at North Carolina State. So, he's a really, really good player. But you can't really say that he's kind of a knockout prospect. Like in my opinion, that Jonah Williams is. And Williams is not a super athlete for a tackle. He's a pretty good athlete for a guard. And so he's not an amazing system fit, but he has run zone before. Like, he knows what that's like, and he's got pretty good footwork for it. And so I would, and in that mock, I ended up taking the great player who's a good fit, because I think that you just get more out of that, especially because it allows you to do more things. So, for example, on 3rd and 7, you're not going to be able to do play action because it's just not going to move the defense or anything like that. And so you just have to do a straight drop back pass. And if you've got Jonah Williams in there at guard versus Garrett Bradbury, I'm a little bit more comfortable. So I ended up picking Jonah Williams, and I think that that's kind of the criteria by which you look at it.
All right, John Belk has a question. He says, there seems to be a clear top 2 defensive line and a top 2 offensive line. If any of them start to fall, what would you be willing to give up to trade up for them?
I assume that the second of the top 2 offensive linemen is Jawan Taylor. If it's not, it's Andre Dillard, which in my mind makes it not clear who the top 2 are. I would not trade up for Jawan Taylor. I've watched a lot less of him than I have Jonah Williams and Andre Dillard. So I'm willing to walk back this take, but I just don't feel like he's a great fit for the Vikings. And in particular, I've got a lot of concerns about him in pass protection. I mean, he is relatively average in terms of pass protection numbers, and it's not as I mean, he's a great run blocker, but it's not as if the way that he did run blocking is going to likely be the way that he run blocks for Minnesota, which is not really the case for Garrett Bradbury. It's going to be kind of the exact same stuff. And so I don't know how much of his great run blocking translates. So I don't know if I would trade up for Jawan Taylor. And if he falls to 18, the Vikings draft him, kind of makes sense. But then you've got a question about, they were both right tackles in college. Who's best suited to left, Brian O'Neill or Jawan Taylor? So I wouldn't trade up for him. Jonah Williams, I would. The Vikings, they just don't tend to trade up with that first pick. So we'll see. And then for the defensive linemen, if Quinnen Williams or Ed Oliver falls, yes. Trade up for them. If they fall to 11 and you're Green Bay Packers might take them at 12, trade up 7 spots. I don't know how much it'll take. Recoup the draft capital later by trading Trey Waynes for a second. And then now you can trade down in the second and the third, and now you've got, your 10 picks or whatever. Obviously one of them has to be used on a cornerback now, but yeah, I would trade definitely up for one of those 2. Now, if it's Jerry Tillery, who I think is kind of underrated right now, I'd probably just let that guy fall to me. Rashawn Gary, people are really down on him because he's not good yet. That's a fair reason to not be high on a player, I guess. But he's, got a ton of athletic potential, and he kind of flashes it sometimes, and he'd be a good fit for a coaching staff that the Vikings have. I wouldn't trade up for him. But yeah, I would trade up for probably just Jonah Williams, maybe Andre Dillard, who'd be a pretty good fit given his athleticism. We don't know if the type of run blocking that he would do with the Vikings is something he's naturally good at, but we can kind of presume that based off of his athleticism that he'd probably be good at it. I've been talking to some offensive line coaches about Andre Dillard specifically, and they love him, and they're old school, run blocking matters a lot kind of guys, and he had 200 run blocking snaps maybe in his career at Washington State, and despite that they seem to love him. So my guess is that he'll be a very good run blocker, and he did a very good job of that at the Senior Bowl. So I'd probably trade up for Andre Dillard. I would trade up for Jonah Williams, but not as much as I'd trade up for Quinnen Williams and Ed Oliver.
All right, so we have a question from Florian Blast, and it was, what happened to Jonah Williams' draft stock? A month or so ago, it felt like the Vikings wanted him, or if the Vikings wanted him, they definitely have to trade up. Now a lot of mocks have him falling to them. What's going on with Jonah Williams?
I think for a lot of people, their answer to this is that we got bored, and I don't think that that's fair. So a lot of people will say, hey, we're just so used to his dominance for so long. We just got bored, and now he's falling because of that or whatever, right? But that doesn't really track. I mean, we didn't get bored of Andrew Luck. I mean, he went 1-1, right? We didn't get bored of Sam Bradford. He went 1-1. These are guys that were the presumed number 1 prospect coming into the year that they ended up getting drafted, and they ended up performing about as well as Jonah Williams did at his position. I mean, maybe a little bit better, actually, and ended up going 1-1. The issue, I think, is that the post-draft process or the postseason process the pre-draft process, is not fit for a guy like Jonah Williams, right? He doesn't get to go to the Senior Bowl because I don't think he's a senior. If he is, he didn't go. So he can't kind of keep his name relevant at that point in the season. And then, he's not a super athlete, and we saw, the debate between Eric Fisher and Luke Jokel, that got settled when Eric Fisher was a better tester, right? And I'm not going to say that's the only reason, but that played a role, right? And Jonah Williams is in a draft class with some pretty unlikely athletes. And I mean that in the sense that we don't tend to see offensive linemen test as well as they just happened to this year, right? I already talked about Andre Dillard, but you had, pretty good testing from, like I said, Garrett Bradbury. You had some pretty good testing from some of the middle of the class guys. Eric McCoy did well, Elton Jenkins did well. And then, Williams is not kind of a measurables guy, right? His arms were just underneath what you'd want for a tackle, and he didn't have the requisite, 3-cone score to say, he can make up for that length problem. And so it's just not a process that works for him. And so that's kind of why he fell. And honestly, I don't hate it, not just because the Vikings can benefit from it, but I think abstractly, it makes sense because teams are building, not all teams, but like a lot of teams are building their model of these players based off of what has historically worked. I mean, there have been good tackles with bad measurables, or good college tackles with bad measurables who ended up failing. People are going to remember Orlando Brown, who was a good tackle with bad measurables that ended up, having a really good rookie year. But I mean, like, it does happen, right? And so that's where those kind of translation questions occur. So I don't hate it. It makes sense, but I don't think the answer, the draft community got bored or teams got bored, really holds up, because sometimes a player is kind of anointed at their position. They perform about as well as you'd expect, and they go where you expect. So, I don't think that's it.
Kenneth Allen asks, which player will publicly call out Arif next?
Well, I mean, who's the next Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee, right? That's the pattern we've established.
It's going to end up being Thielen, isn't it?
It probably is, yeah. I tend to pick fights with, like, good guys. That's not great.
Yeah. I feel like that ends up being more of a character flaw, or at least says something more about you.
Well, I'm just like, poor choices. I don't think I am morally bad. I don't think that. I think it's just a series of poor choices I continue to make.
You are not wired to believe that even for a moment. So why would that be something that would come into your head?
Right. Yeah. Why would I bring that up? No, it's just like, a lot of people will say you got to pick your fights. I don't do that. Maybe I should start.
I mean, as it turns out, apparently there's a healthy Twitter following of people who do not believe in the power of the Mongolian army. So, I mean, you could take up that mantle too, as we discussed earlier.
I will say this. Chad Greenway and I fought because I thought he was bad, right? Like, I thought, like, you were really good for a while. You should have gone to a couple more Pro Bowls than you did. Then you fell off, and fans are, I don't want to make this personal because Chad's good as a person, but fans, and I think the team elevated kind of who he was as a player based off of what he had done and not what he could do. Of course, we end up going to a game and he ends up having a pick six, and I have to deal with that. But for the most part, he wasn't
on your
playing.
Birthday. It was great.
Yeah, on my birthday, right? Yeah. So for the most part, he wasn't playing very well, right? Kyle Rudolph is like fine. Like, he's fine. I would say, he's a little overpaid, and he's like the 10th highest paid tight end, which is like not that much. I think a lot of fans expected that number to be higher. And he's, a little bit, maybe not quite that. Right. So, okay, fine. He ends up having a couple of career years. He's had a couple of years where he's had over 500 yards receiving. He's like fine. But the thing that just happened was, Sports Center put out a poll like who's tight end one now, that Rob Gronkowski has retired. And, they've got George Kittle, they've got Zach Ertz, they've got Travis Kelce, 3 guys that make sense as kind of the usual suspects that you'd put there. Maybe Kittle's not, quote unquote, the usual suspect, but he's kind of demonstrated 2 years of really good play. And then like Kyle Rudolph. And I was like, what? That's like, you can't even.
I like when they reissued that tweet again, then they removed his picture.
Yeah. So tweeted it out with Kyle Rudolph, and then ESPN tweeted out the same thing, but it was just other instead of Kyle Rudolph.
It's just a big question mark. Like it's actually the Riddler who's going to be number 4 on that. But it does ask the question, which Kenneth Allen does here. Where does Rudolph actually rank among the tight ends? Is he in the top 15?
That is a really good question. So intuitively, I would say he's inside the top 15, but like not enormously inside it. So I'll also say this: PFF grades just kind of hate him because he's consistently a very poor blocker, right? But they're not penalizing someone like Gerald Everett for being a bad blocker because the Chargers just didn't ask him to block. Like, why would they? But the Vikings keep on asking Kyle Rudolph to block. And he's just like not good at it, so his PFF grade gets dinged. So if we're in kind of a scenario where we're asking these players to do the things that they're the best at and then value those things, right? Then we're in a situation where we can, I think, more properly evaluate Kyle Rudolph. So I would say, Travis Kelce, George Kittle, and Zach Ertz are better than him. Fine. Very easy to say that. I would also say that pure receiving guys like Evan Ingram and Gerald Everett, I'd probably put ahead of him as well. Delaney Walker, only had 1 game last year, but if he's still active, I put him on the list. I'd say you can't at this point, so I'd move him out. But I think Dallas Goedert, the other tight end in Philadelphia, might already be better than him too. Tyler Eifert, for the games that he's healthy for, right, would be better than him. But after that, it's difficult. Did Trey Burton really play at a level where I'd say he's better than Kyle Rudolph? Probably not, right? Hayden Hurst obviously didn't. Mark Andrews, I would want to wait another year before I said something like that. But he played really well, but I wouldn't say that. O.J. Howard, I would definitely put above Kyle Rudolph. But yeah, that puts him kind of inside the top 10, where I'm getting to the point where I can't name, more than 10 guys, right? If Eric Ebron kind of continues, what he's doing, maybe, but I'm still not confident in him. Greg Olsen is kind of at the tail end of his career, so I wouldn't put him up there. Yeah, maybe for 1 more year, but not for like the long haul or anything like that. But yeah, maybe Jordan Reed. So he's just kind of inside. He's definitely inside. I would say the top 15. Probably maybe inside the top 10. But at that point, you have to like kind of make tough decisions, and then that's fine. That tells you everything you need to know.
Luke Braun asks, over under 1.5 AAF alumni on the Vikings by September. Practice squad counts.
Practice squad counts? I'd say over. I think Carter Schultz is like an ideal practice squad guy. He just like screams practice squad, right? Because you've probably got a mid-round draft pick at edge. You've got Stephen Weatherly. You've got Deshaun Bauer. My guess is that both Ifeadi Odenigbo and Jalen Holmes are playing defensive tackle and not edge. And then you get some other undrafted guys. So I assume that Carter Schultz is going to be better than undrafted free agent rookies. That's obviously not always going to be the case, but I think that that's a fair bet because he played against guys that were generally better than UDFAs. And because most UDFAs didn't even have the ability to sniff the AAF, right? And so, and he dominated them. So I'd say he's probably better than UDFAs. So the question is he better than Deshaun Bauer? Is he better than Stephen Weatherly? Is he better than a mid-round draft pick? Probably not. And then that puts him on the practice squad because he's interesting and he can be productive. So there's that. And then I think Darren Smith kind of makes the team, right? So that puts it at over. Plus you've got kind of the odds of maybe the other guys like Duke Thomas or Jordan Martin. Who I just looked up his PFF grade. Jordan Martin, if he didn't miss tackles like all the time, would be all right. But apparently he like missed tackles in every single game for the San Diego Fleet. So we'll see how that goes.
All right, and my favorite question of the show is also from Luke Braun. And I got a couple things to read from our listeners here.
This is a very you question.
Yeah, this is pretty good. You can pick any Avenger to join the Vikings in any capacity, but they can't use their superpowers. Like Bruce Banner is the person, not the Hulk. So who do you pick, and what do they do? The best ones I thought were Ryan, who said Black Panther. He played Vontae Mack in draft day, and when he wasn't protecting Wakanda, he went first overall.
That's a really good argument, but you can't pick the actor, right? You gotta pick.
I don't know. I think that there might be something there. But Adam West said Thor, his superpower is being the god of lightning. He gets his raw power just by being Asgardian, so he's playing either offensive line or defensive tackle.
I mean, that's defensive tackle stuff right there. But that generated its own discussion.
Yeah, it did, because whether or not Asgardians are a race, which then got, somebody got called a racist, and that's kind of the end of that. Which, I mean, it's Twitter. It happens.
Then we're done.
Yeah, it happens. It's Twitter, so it happens like every day, but still.
Right. Well, so for the discussion to be interesting, we have to strip them of what we would consider superpowers to us, and
correct.
so. I would say in this case, you've got Thor is just a really strong dude. You don't know about his flexibility. You don't know about his speed, probably fast. But, he doesn't have superpowers, right?
Yeah.
But my guess is that a depowered Thor has NFL level athleticism. I think that that's like a fair thing to say. But my guess is also that because he's never had to work on like flexibility or bend in his life, that he's like a Taylor Mays kind of athlete.
Yeah, possible. Damian Barrett says, Rocket Raccoon. I don't know what position he'd play, but he'd be great at press conferences or the media in general.
It'd be funny, but he'd be cut like 10 minutes after meeting Zimmer.
I want to see. Yeah, Rocket Raccoon's actually going to be replacing Wabi, so that'll be fun. Tommy Gunn says Hawkeye as quarterback.
I don't like that because you can't. I mean, the reason he's good at shooting arrows is because he spent all his life shooting arrows. Now, I guess if you say you can develop Hawkeye, like you can put him on your practice squad and develop him for like 3 years as like a Luis Perez, he was bowling for like 10 years before this and now he's a quarterback kind of story. I like his developmental potential over, another random athlete in another sport. Because like there's got to be some level of translatability to that insane accuracy, but it's not happening on day one. That's for sure.
No.
So I don't love that one.
Miles Gorham says Chala opposite Harrison. So Chala from Black Panther.
Yeah. So the question is, how much does T'Challa weigh, right? So Chadwick Boseman's 6 feet tall, but let's pretend that the actor's height isn't necessarily Black Panther's height. Let's say he's a little bit taller, right? 6'1", 6'2". Chadwick Boseman is like 190 pounds, so you probably get a 210-pound Black Panther. You become Black Panther by winning in combat without the superpower flower. That sounds so weak when I say it like that. But you have to be a good athlete going in, is the point. And it's a combat sport. So I like that. He's probably a pretty hard hitter. He probably takes good tackling angles. Coverage is difficult to teach. I'll say that. We had another answer that was even better, that was like right up your alley, that I like even more.
So we also have Josh Swedlin, who says Drax.
Right.
Because even without his powers, Dave Bautista is 6'4" and 289. Put Drax in the hands of Andre Patterson and let that man turn into a true destroyer at 3-tech. Bonus points, Everson Griffin would be his mentor, and tell me that amount of energy wouldn't terrify you as a quarterback.
Yeah, I think that's phenomenal. Obviously, Dave Bautista's like 50 now, but I mean, you get the character, right? So you get Drax, who is like in his... I mean, he's a little bit past his prime. He talks about being a dad, right? But like, he's good. He's athletically in his prime, and it's a guy with Dave Bautista's physique. Great. I mean, Brock Lesnar's like pro day workouts were stunning. They were phenomenal. I've got his number somewhere in my database too. They're really good. And Bautista, like his thing, I mean, you would know better than I would, was that he's an insane athlete. Mm-hmm. So That, I mean, in a ring that includes a bunch of incredible athletes. I think that's great. The real question is whether or not he's an Avenger and qualifies for this. Because if he's not an Avenger, then I would say I would probably take T'Challa, maybe a receiver. I think coverage is like more difficult to learn. T'Challa is like fast, at least in short areas for sure. But I would say T'Challa, and then if I can take, but I would rather take Drax.
So
if I can.
The next two are pretty good. Nick Myers says Luis from Ant-Man, because he'd be able to talk anyone into a trade. Hello, Teron Armstrong for Treadwell.
That's just a front office thing.
Oh, that counts. It'd be Teron Armstead for Treadwell and or a bag of Cheetos.
Well, then I can just pick Tony Stark as owner. Come on.
See, I didn't even want to include that because okay, that's a bit much. Like owner different than anything else.
Front office.
Yeah. And Michael Kinlan said Thanos as GM because he sees the big picture.
Jesus.
I like that one. That got dark real quick.
Yeah. Well, if it was incredible. You'd have no problem cutting players.
Yeah, just it'd be a snap for him.
If I get front office stuff, then I'm absolutely getting Black Widow to do negotiations for me for trades. She's probably one of the few people better than Rick Spielman at this stuff. Like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, will she take a GM's kids hostage for leverage? Maybe. But the point is, you end up with, I think, probably the best negotiator you could possibly have. So if you get front office, I'm taking Black Widow. That's probably way more, winning a bunch of trades, that's probably way more valuable than having Drax at defensive tackle or T'Challa in the slot.
There you go. That is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Arif, what do you have to plug?
So I've got the companion mock up at The Athletic. I've got a piece about the offensive line I'm going to be doing soon, and also a piece about a bunch of players from the AAF that I thought should be in the NFL.
Sounds good. Go ahead and check those out. But that is going to be it for this episode. For Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember to tweet that, even if it is a work in progress. And we will see you soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.